Hello, I'm Essie Fox, and welcome back to my podcast, Talking the Gothic. In this, the second episode, I'll be speaking with Kate Griffin, an author of compelling dark historical novels, as we discuss the type of buildings found within the more traditional Gothic imagery, what followed on, if you will, from the time when Horace Walpole first introduced the reading world to the dramatic nightmare horrors of his Castle of Otranto. Now, if you're interested in the Castle of Otranto, I talked about it in episode 1 along with Dr. Tim Rideout. But moving on to the second episode, I would say that the Castle of Otranto inspired a whole host of novels with settings that we now accept as conventionally Gothic. But did this description come purely from Walpole's story, this description of the Gothic, and how it alludes to architectural design? Well, no. The original name came to us from the Goths, an old Germanic tribe who rose against the Roman Empire and were afterwards condemned for their invasion of the cities in which buildings in the classical Greek or Roman style were vandalized or completely destroyed. Did the Goths then rebuild? It's more likely that they simply cleared the ground for something new to follow on, which, according to the architect, Sir Christopher Wren, was more akin in its style to Islamic architecture. And here I'll quote from Wren himself. This we now call the Gothic manner of architecture. I think it should with more reason be called the Saracen style, for these people wanted neither arts nor learning, and after we in the West lost both, we borrowed again from them, out of their Arabic books, what they with great diligence had translated from the Greeks. So, according to Christopher Wren, Europeans emerged from the conflicts and the destructions in the darker Middle Ages and were all too willing to embrace an Islamic style of building, which would, of course, have been observed by the knights and the followers of them who travelled overseas to engage in holy wars, the same historical crusades that Horace Walpole also touches on in his fictional Castle of Otranto. The writer Jane Johnson has developed this theme in her novel, Pillars of Light, a historical novel exploring love, war, and faith during the Third Crusade. And her book centres on the Islamic linked construction and magnificence of the cathedral here at Wells. Similar endeavours in architectural design were popularised in northern France between the 12th and the 16th centuries. Breathtaking, towering structures flooded with light from stained glass windows with pointed arches, vaulted ceilings, flying buttresses, and gargoyles gloating down on those below. A very common style today found in ancient churches and cathedrals in most areas of Europe, as well as palaces of kings, town halls and universities, even in wealthy private homes. The grandeur of these buildings is undeniable, although in Gothic literature, they're more likely to be found in a state of decay with crumbling walls strangled by vines or struck by bolts of lightning, much like the Castle of Otranto in the book's dramatic climax. This imagery of ruined glory is a powerful mirror to reflect the corruption of a world in decline, in which ideas of good and evil are in a constant state of struggle, and where tyrannical oppressors torment the lost or innocent. Ruined stones, draped in shadow and despair, provide the perfect backdrop on which to depict dark or supernatural themes. Castles and stately homes might have hidden passageways, such as the priest holes constructed during the times of persecution. Dripping dungeons and crypts might hold the bones of prisoners long since abandoned to their fates. Doors could be locked and keys concealed, as well as the ghastly secrets in the rooms of doors they opened, which puts me in mind of the fairy tales like Charles Perrault's Bluebeard, published in 1697, in which the innocent young bride of an older wealthy man is given the keys to every room in the castle where he's taken her to live, except for one with the sternest command never to open up that one door, for, as she later finds out, it will lead her to the blood-drenched, murdered bodies of the wives who also dared to look inside. Or there's the story of Rapunzel, recorded by the Brothers Grimm in 1812, in which a wicked witch confines a child in a tower, where she eventually grows up to be a beautiful young woman, and from where her singing lures a prince who climbs the ladder of her hair until discovered by the witch when he falls and is blinded by the barricade of thorns growing down below the tower. These tales of caution are linked to ideas of misplaced trust and dawning sexuality, with the architectural settings providing symbols undeniably Freudian in nature. But as important is the sense of these iconic ancient structures as being remote from daily life, almost like places in a dream. And in a dream, almost anything can happen because there are no rules and restrictions that society observes, and even the law of heaven can be challenged by hell. And really, I think this is at the heart of all Gothic literature, with decaying, spooky settings amplifying or enhancing the effect of dislocation. The fear felt by a victim when they're suddenly uprooted and imprisoned in a world where normal rules simply don't apply, whether that's due to evil deeds carried out by fellow men or malign supernatural forces. Matthew Lewis's The Monk, first published in the 1790s, all too graphically describes the corruption of a soul when spirituality is thwarted by sexual obsession, with acts of blasphemy and simmering desire going on within a monastery walls. Whatever the more prudish Victorians must have made of that work of literature, I can only imagine. But even in the Georgian era, which was a great deal more permissive, the critics were appalled by the fiction they described as being lewd, sacrilegious, and unfit for all young readers. Now, while you're dashing to the bookshops to purchase your own copy, I'll recommend Anne Radcliffe's somewhat staider Mysteries of Udolpho as well. And that poetically describes the most sublime of natural landscapes, but all infused with Gothic dread and a sense of looming menace when orphaned Emily St. Aubert is removed from those she loves to be confined in the prison of a medieval castle in the Apennine Mountains. Another daunting mountain fortress is perhaps better known in Bram Stoker's Dracula, but ancestral family homes can be just as menacing as they entomb the darkest secrets. Another form of the undead being vividly described in Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, where themes of madness, isolation, and cataleptic trances are to be found in a mansion on the verge of collapse, with a backstory alluding to a medieval tale, a world that's really not so unlike the one described by Horace Walpole. And like Walpole's Otranto, the House of Usher finds its climax in a terrifying storm towards the end of the book. The influences of the first Gothic novel are clear, but as time passes, so the world changes. And though still following many of the tropes, more recent work has certainly evolved. And there is one that has had a huge effect on me from the time when I was just about 12 years old and I stayed up late one night to watch a horror film screened on the television set after my parents had gone to bed. That film was The Haunting, made in 1963 and directed by Robert Wise. And with its creaking iron staircases or doors with ornate carvings taking on monstrous living forms, with deafening sounds like the thudding of a drum or perhaps a beating heart, I was left so traumatized I couldn't sleep a wink that night, but lay in bed and listened out for every sound around me in my very modern house. Whereas Hill House, as originally conceived in the novel, written by Shirley Jackson, was something a great deal older, much more isolated and decidedly more Gothic. To give you a flavour of Hill House. I'm going to read the novel's first few lines. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against the hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright. Bricks met neatly, floors were firm and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. What's going on with this description is a thing of genius, with an immediate sense of unease and dislocation, and with the reader overwhelmed by an ominous foreboding, all before a single character has been introduced on the page. But then Hill House is the main player in this classic horror story. Another house where every stone hums with a dread expectation is that of Mandalay in du Maurier's Rebecca. And once again, it is the house that's introduced on the first page in the following lines. Last night, I dreamt I went to Mandalay again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive, and for a while I could not enter, for the way was barred to me. There was a padlock and a chain upon the gate. I called in my dream to the lodge-keeper, and had no answer, and peering closer through the rusted spokes of the gate, I saw the lodge was uninhabited. No smoke came from the chimney, and the little lattice windows gaped forlorn. Then, like all dreamers, I was possessed of a sudden with supernatural powers, and passed like a spirit through the barrier before me. The drive wound away in front, twisting and turning as it had always done, but as I advanced, I was aware that a change had come upon it. It was narrow and unkempt, not the drive that we had known. At first I was puzzled and did not understand, and it was only when I bent my head and to avoid the low swinging branch of a tree that I realized what had happened. Nature had come into her own, and little by little, in her stealthy, insidious way, had encroached upon the drive with long, tenacious fingers. The woods, always a menace, even in the past, had triumphed in the end. They crowded, dark and uncontrolled, to the borders of the drive. The beeches with white, naked limbs leant close to one another, their branches intermingled in a strange embrace, making a vault above my head like the archway of a church. And there were other trees as well, trees that I did not recognize, squat oaks and tortured elms that straggled cheek by jowl with the beeches and had thrust themselves out of the quiet earth, along with monster shrubs and plants, none of which I remembered. Well, is your skin prickling to imagine such a scene, all conveyed with such precision and a clarity of vision? Well, the effect of this description is not only to provide you with a setting for the novel, but, much like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, du Maurier incurs a sense of melancholy doom, something imagined again in a dream. And as such, can it be trusted, this memory that's emerged from the past, this sense of mystery and danger in which the locked iron gates and the encroaching wilderness of nature untamed seem to be warning of some danger, of abandonment, of death? So, on that rather dark theme of mystery, death, and nature pervading all, I'd like to dive a little deeper into the architecture of the Gothic and welcome Kate Griffin, whose novels are infused with darkly haunting atmospheres. Hello, Kate, and welcome to
Hello.
Talking the Gothic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, Essie.
Kate, you're now a full-time writer, but I know in the past you've worked in the world of antiques and you've also been employed with the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings, all of which are experiences I'm sure you now bring into your fiction, which is full of
Definitely.
such assured and visual, vivid descriptions. But thinking more specifically about houses in Gothic books, I'd like to take this
Mhm.
opportunity to introduce the listeners to your novel, Fine Shade, with Fine Shade being an old house in the wilds of Derbyshire. Can you tell
Mm.
us something about its physical appearance and how it might look if observed by any passing travellers? And did you have any particular building in mind when you were writing this book, or is Fine Shade simply constructed from your imagination?
No, I definitely had a house in mind when I wrote this book, and that house was Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, which is a really exquisite medieval manor house, quite a large one. It's grey stone, it's kind of got courtyards, flagstoned courtyards, turrets, and anybody who has read Jane Eyre will probably be familiar with Haddon Hall because I'm fairly certain that Charlotte Bronte had it in mind when she wrote about Thornfield Hall. They're very, very similar. They say they share a DNA, and the likelihood is that it was the model for that building because her great friend Ellen Nussey was the sister of a curate who worked in the area, and she often visited her. So many houses in Derbyshire are called Thorn something, or villages are called Thorn something. So I think it was a nod to her friend. And the thing about visitors and Fine Shade is the great key to Fine Shade is that nobody would visit it because it's so remote. I imagine it to be kind of like marooned in a valley in the depths of the Peak District.
Mm,
And it's not somewhere that a visitor, and probably deliberately, it's not somewhere that a visitor would come across.
so very
And the
classically
name,
Gothic.
it's very, yeah, absolutely, as you know, as the queen of the Gothic, you would know that that's absolutely the key is isolation, secrecy, and mystery.
Mm, definitely. Well, once we enter the doors, we find that Fine Shade is a house draped in mystery and shadow. It's filled with objects that, even within the time frame of the novel, which I think I'm correct in saying is the early 1800s, would have been
Yes.
viewed as antique.
Yes.
You give such a sense of gravitas and history and age, and the atmosphere is enhanced even more by the sounds of certain musical instruments that
Hmm.
pluck upon our nerves to elevate the eerie mood and induce paranoia. I've used this device myself in a few novels, with a piano that plays itself in The Goddess and the Thief, or a ghostly
Yes.
woman singing in The Fascination, and more recently in Dangerous. Not an instrument, but a palazzo in Venice is filled with the sounds of lapping waters that some of the inhabitants mistake for the sound of ghosts' mournful sighs and cries of pain. And in Fine Shade, there's a harp, and it's a haunting sound, harking back to darker medieval times, and
Yes.
also a gilded clockwork monkey that's decidedly unnerving and which tinkles a tune when the mechanism's wound using a key. So we have that key theme again that I spoke about
Mm,
earlier in this podcast with Bluebeard. And it
mm.
really
It's
is
a psychological
unnerving.
thing, isn't it? A
Yes,
key.
very much how the opening of a mystery, the
Yeah,
clues.
it's
But
very opening
I
the
think
mind.
when this mechanism is wound of this object, it seems all the more exotic when we learn that it's been brought as a gift from India and presented to a wife of the house who's now deceased. Although we do see her face in a portrait on the wall, and her
Mm,
likeness provides a mirror to the living orphaned child who's been left behind and who um, your narrator, a young woman called Marta, has been employed to come and care for in the role of governess. So Marta's looking after Grace, this very young child.
mm,
But Marta is far from any normal governess. And when it comes to her charge, there's something rather fey about Grace. So could you
mm.
reveal as much as possible, because I know you won't want to give too much away, but a little bit more about what makes Grace different and how that adds to the sense of the story's confusion and sense of unease? Because Grace seems to know things about the house that Marta doesn't. And
Yes.
again,
Well,
this
Grace
reminds me of
knows.
Bluebeard.
Well, exactly. Well, Grace is probably the key to the story, actually. She's the key to the house, definitely. She is, as you say, fey and a little bit eerie. And Marta herself is not the normal. I mean, you will know, Essie, that one of the great tropes of the Gothic novel is that a nice girl goes to an old dark house and kind of like is faced with unrelenting evil and secrecy. Well, in Fine Shade, Marta is the horrible terror. Marta is the terror. She is the person that everyone should fear because she goes to the house with a very set agenda, and she is not a nice girl, I think, to put it basically. And she is rather shocked when she first meets Grace because she has decided, which definitely she's set her cap at whoever the master of the house is. She hasn't even met this man, but she has decided very much that she is going to be the chatelaine, whoever he is. Um, and she thinks that she'll worm her way into his affections by kind of treating his daughter as an absolute flower of Victorian womanhood and kind of teaching her French and dancing and all of the great accomplishments of a young woman. What she actually finds is that Grace is about 10 years old and she's obviously got learning disabilities, but I was careful not to be really specific
Mhm.
about what those disabilities were. And I consulted friends who have children with difficulties to make sure that they weren't insulted by my portrayal of her. And they weren't, fortunately, but then they are my friends. So I suppose that's a caveat. So Grace is very difficult to teach. But she does have an extraordinary talent, which is that she draws absolutely perfectly. She draws from life. She captures the spirit of things, and she captures things very accurately. And so Marta is very happy to allow Grace to draw and draw and draw. But the other thing that Grace has, which is probably the actual key, is that she's been left alone in the house in the company of some very caring and very nice old ladies who really want the best for her, but have no idea, as kind of like Derbyshire women, what to do. And she's explored the house in that time. And when I say explored the house, she has explored every nook and cranny, including
Mm.
every passage, every priest hole, every secret alleyway behind the paneling. And so she knows her way around the house in a way that becomes useful to Marta. And
Yeah.
Marta follows Grace and thinks that she's manipulating her, or is she? That's the
Oh,
question.
this is so wonderful in the book. I love this sense, and we don't quite know what's going on. And also, Grace has these dolls which are very eerie.
Well,
And these
dolls are
dolls
always
are
eerie.
quite representative of characters in the novel. But
Mm,
of course, Marta, who thinks, as you say, she's in control, isn't aware of what they represent. And in fact,
mm.
Marta does think she's so in control because there's one a few lines where she's describing her when she first arrives at the house, and Marta says, many would find much to fear in fine shades dark and crumbling corridors, its unseen master and its silent servants, but not I, for they have far more to fear from me. So she's no cowering maiden in distress like Isabella in Otranto or Nell in Hill House, but here is someone who's already far more worldly and hardened to the world. She's been through quite a lot already. Can you tell us a
Mm.
little more about Marta's past before she's entered Fine Shane's
Yes.
doors?
Oh,
And also, I just wondered, as a novel character, does she arrive fully formed in your mind? Because she really is the most marvelous character. And she has
thank you.
agency and courage and ambition and a sense of destiny, doesn't she? She has a very strong
Yes,
sense of her own destiny.
very. Very strong sense. It's bizarre actually. She did arrive in my mind completely fully formed. And I think kind of lots of writers will agree that sometimes a character starts speaking to you in your head, and that voice is kind of perfect in a way and almost dictates what you write. And she's such an awful, dreadful character, Essie, that I sometimes wonder about, whether I am that person. I do
I
hope I'm
don't totally
not.
agree. I think, I agree she does some awful things and she's quite selfish and manipulative, but I find myself rooting for Marta.
Yes, people have. And that's very odd. Lots of people really root for her, even though she does some dreadful things in the book and also thinks dreadful things because you are in her head. You as the reader, it's told from a kind of first person perspective, and you're definitely in her head. I think sometimes people begin reading the book and they feel very sympathetic towards her because she comes from a remote village called Croyle, which I've made up, but I imagine it's in the Fenland somewhere
Hmm.
or in the Weald, Fenland Weald. And she's clearly been having an affair with the local vicar's son because one day he's going to inherit the big house on the hill from his uncle. Um,
He
and
likes a
everyone's
fine
very
house.
well, exactly. Yeah, well, Martha does love a fine house. Exactly. That's a passion in life. A bit like mine, really, I suppose. That's where we do have something in common. And so when people in the village find out she's quite young, I think she's probably around about 19. 19 or 20. When people in the village find out that she has been having quite a passionate affair and quite a repulsive affair, actually, with the local vicar's son, it's everybody acts together to get her out of the village and as far away as possible because she
Yeah.
is the least appropriate person for him to
So
marry.
she's
So,
sort of been almost banished in a way. It's been the easiest way to
yes,
banish her, to find her a job as a governess. And one thing that
yes,
struck me about reading about this and her introduction as a governess in Fine Shade is that the Fine Shade, the house, as you alluded to before, is filled with many female servants, many of them quite
yes,
old. It's almost like that classic Gothic nunnery in a way. It's a
exactly.
different spin on that. And Martha herself is anything but holy, although she does try to convince them of that. But
Mm.
this also reminded me of, Matthew Lewis's The Monk with the nunnery illusion, where the conventions of religion are turned on their heads by sexual desire. And sex is important in this book, isn't it?
It is.
Martha
It's important to Marta. Yeah.
Marta is a very physical person, and she's using her beauty and her body as currency to weave a bond, she hopes, with the young monk who will become the master and who is the heir of Fine Shade.
Mm.
And he's called Vaughan Pritchard. And he is very much disliked by the servants, isn't he? But we don't quite know why. And he's banned from
Oh,
entering the house. And this is another
he's been banished
mystery.
tale.
It's
He
quite
like
fairy
Marta, he's been
tale-ish, isn't
banished.
it? It's
Yeah.
quite fairy tale.
Yes.
And also, I think your physical description of him with his piercing blue eyes, jet black hair, he's obviously very alluring. He's also dangerous. And
Mm.
he is the traditional sort of Gothic libertine. And I
Mm.
can, there's a scene where Martha's looking at him across a river, which I think is a wonderful foreshadowing of the book that
Of
you
who
have
she is.
referenced as a,
Yes.
follow on from this.
Well,
But was Vaughan Pritchard informed by any particular character in your mind in Gothic fiction or real history, or was he, did he just again come to you fully formed?
I think actually you will know all about this because I think he's quite Byronic, actually. The idea of him being kind of like so
In
dark and
looks,
so
definitely.
serious in
Yeah,
looks, in looks. I mean,
yes.
he's no poet, I don't think.
And appetite.
And and appetites, yes. Yeah, I mean he does, as you say, he kind of conforms to that Gothic, the Gothic anti-hero, I suppose, really, or the
Hmm.
Gothic. I mean, there's also a little hint, I suppose, of Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre, which is a book that I kind of like have
Yes, that's another
definitely,
book that we find,
yeah, find hints
echoes
of,
of.
and you all know this, but kind of like when James first meets Rochester, he's riding through the fog on his horse, and his
Hmm.
great dog Pilot comes bounding out, and kind of and in the same way, the first time Marta meets Vaughan, without knowing who he is, because Jane doesn't know that Rochester is returning to Thornfield, she meets him when she's walking by the river, as you say, and he's exercising his hawk, Dido.
Yes, I think the way
So
you use animals and nature in this, again, which makes me think of that opening passage I read earlier in the podcast from Rebecca, is and how
yeah,
nature takes over. But with this, you use animals, so you've got the hawk, and that's really, really menacing. In the stables, you have a stallion that is very, very spirited, to say
vicious.
the least,
Yeah,
and
very,
quite
and
vicious.
only Vaughan really can cope with
Yeah.
him.
And Vaughan
They,
himself is almost werewolfish. I
he
feel
is,
that
yeah,
there's
he's
something
wolfish.
animal about him,
Yeah,
definitely.
definitely, and
Um,
especially in his appetites. And they're all familiars. I don't know whether you picked this up, but I've given every character a familiar.
I didn't
So
pick that
apart
up,
from
Kate.
Marta, so Marta's
That was remiss
familiar.
of me.
No, 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 no. It doesn't. So Marta dabbles in witchcraft or believes herself to be a witch because
Yes,
her
you have a lot. You have
mother.
this black magic theme when she's conjuring spells using her menstrual blood
Yes,
or strands of
yeah.
hair. And I was going to ask you about that. So tell us a bit more about
No.
that.
Well, she kind of, I'm not sure whether she actually is a witch or not. She certainly believes herself to be a witch because she
Yeah.
believes herself to be so many things. She kind of, so is she a witch or isn't she? I err to the side that she probably is a witch, and these were skills taught to her by her grandmother back in Croyle. And at the
Grandmère,
beginning
yes.
of the book, it's her grandmother's funeral. So there's nobody who is protecting her anymore, which is why they find it very easy to send her away. Because she and her
Mm.
grandmother had a clear bond. And her grandmother obviously was kind of a village cunning woman, I suppose. but she was also French, so therefore completely somebody to kind of be very suspicious of. So Marta brings that sort of baggage with her as well. But Grace has a familiar, which is Lancer the dog. Vaughan has a familiar, which is Dido the hawk.
Mhm.
And there's a moment where Marta keeps seeing a hare running through the courtyards and things, and
Oh,
she's
yeah.
taught that, her grandmother says to her, you must always be wary that those animals, those creatures have a significance for us. Never, never
Also,
kind of.
of great significance in this novel is the moon.
And the moon, of course, yeah. And she uses moon magic, which her grandmother has taught her. And
Mm.
every month. So she's there for 6 months. She arrives just kind of in the beginning of the year in the bone month, which is February, which is bone moon month. And she leaves under a cloud, let's say, at the beginning of summer in June. And so every month of that story is kind of like delineated by the moon of that month. And the moon always has a meaning to that stage of Marta's life as
It
well.
gives the novel a fantastic framing. It's a very artistic, clever device, and I
Oh,
love
thank you.
that. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, I'm thinking now that maybe it might be time. I don't know if it's the moon time or what cycle in the moon, but it might be time for the big reveal about
Oh, yes.
maybe
Yeah,
um,
no, it's fine. It's
what
fine
it
because I think
is, what book it is that you have in
so.
mind very strongly when you were writing Fine Shade.
Okay, there were two books I had in mind. I think this is my contribution to a subgenre of the Gothic, which I will lovingly call governess Gothic. And I think there are two greats of governess Gothic. One is Jane Eyre, which I think is the kind of like progenitor of a lot of that sort of book, those books.
Yes.
And the other is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. And Fine Shade is a bridge between Jane Eyre and The Turn of the Screw. And the character of Marta is a character who appears in The Turn of the Screw. And I've often described at sort of events and festivals, I've said that Fine Shade is not a ghost story, it's a ghost's story. Because I'm quite happy to reveal that Marta goes on at the end of Fine Shade to be Miss Jessel. We don't know her name throughout the book. I think, in fact, the last line of the book is something like, welcome to Bly Manor, Miss
Yes.
Jessel.
Yes.
So, and if you know, you then kind of realize that all of the terrible things she's done are about to be paid back a millionfold because
I
Miss
just think
Jessel
it's so clever because we also then realize so much more about Miss Jessel and how she would be willing to become involved with
with well the thing about Miss Jessel is that, and the thing about Marta as well, is that she's always had a terrible weakness for a red-haired cruel man
and Quint. It's
who
Quint, isn't it?
Nathaniel,
Is
and
very
that's Quint.
attractive.
Yeah.
Mm.
But Nathaniel, who is her first love, who I think kind of she always secretly
She
loves.
hankers back
She
to him,
doesn't like
doesn't
him.
she? She
She
definitely
thinks
hankers
of him a
back.
lot.
Yes, she
And then she
does.
kind of like thinks of him and then thinks, oh God, I'm not thinking about him now. But so
Yes.
physically he is her type, I suppose.
And then
So
he
when she
probably would
arrives,
have been a wonderful husband for her. And then she ends up meeting
Peter
this
Quint,
other
but she's a
red-headed man.
well, exactly. But as you said, she is a very sexual being, and I think her appetites, like Vaughan's, are very difficult. It's very difficult for her to subsume. So when at the end of the book she arrives at Bly Manor, and I'm not kind of giving anything away because I think a lot of people would have read it by now. She's met on the steps by a handsome red-headed man
Yeah.
with flashing green eyes, who is everything that Nathaniel was, but more. He's more of a man. He's more assured. He's more, and he leads her into the house, and then we
And
know
this
that
is
her
her
fate.
destiny. She's always known
It's
she's
her
got
destiny.
a destiny, but she's always
Yeah.
hoped it's a happy one. And there we go. So I think that's
And
brilliant.
her destiny, her grandmother told her that her destiny was a P and she thought it was Pritchard, but it's actually P for Peter Quint.
Right.
And Fine Shade, the name of the house, in the book and the name of the book, is actually, I mean, shade is another word for ghost. And so Fine Shade, although it is also the house, it is Martha's destiny to become a fine ghost, a fine shadow haunting the pages of Henry James.
Poor Marta. She does suffer, but
I
she's
know,
a
I put her
brilliant
through it.
character. She's a brilliant character, and I
Thank
really,
you.
really do recommend this book to all lovers of the Gothic. But
Oh, thank you.
you haven't just written this, you've written many novels, and if anybody is interested, Kate has written a series called Kitty Peck and the Music Hall Mysteries,
Oh,
which I absolutely recommend. And I do think that, we could come back in another episode and discuss The Turn of the Screw in a lot more detail, and also Jane Eyre, and also the theatre and its role
yes.
in Gothic
Yeah,
literature, because there are some wonderful books based on the theatre. But
absolutely. And I love the theatre.
would you
So
like to tell the readers what you're actually working on at the moment? Because I know you are
I,
very busy. You've got one book
I
out and
am.
a follow-up coming very soon next year, I
Yes,
think.
so with my writing partner, Marcia Hutchinson, we wrote The Blackbirds of St Giles, which is set in Georgian London largely, and it's about the little known but very present Black community of people who lived in the Rookery of Georgian London. The St Giles Rookery was a place of poverty, violence, and despair. And unsurprisingly, when you had nowhere else to go in London, or if you've been kind of like if you're a criminal or if you've been traduced, as our characters are, you ended up in the St Giles Rookery. So we have written a book which came out this year about a brother and sister who, Daniel and Pearl, who Daniel fought for the British in the American War of Independence. He distinguished himself. He ends up in London in possession of an inheritance and a fortune. It looks like everything is going to go brilliantly for them, but of course it doesn't. And that book, we were heavily influenced by the idea of Dickens and the idea of betrayal and trust, which I think is a great theme in Dickensian books. And we tried to make Georgian London feel very real and very gritty and very not like polite society, very not like the
Well,
kind of the Georgian world you'd read in Jane Austen. And we're writing the
but you
sequel now,
absolutely
which is
succeeded. You absolutely
oh,
succeeded. And if anybody, I've read the book. I absolutely loved it. I could
thank
not
you.
stop turning the pages. You are such a clever storyteller, and you and Marcia have done a wonderful job. And also, if people prefer an audiobook, there is a narration by Patterson Joseph, very
Which is
well
extraordinary.
known actor,
Mm.
and it's brilliant.
He's brilliant. He, from the very earliest, he read a very early draft of he's a friend of Marcia's. He read a very early draft of the Blackbirds of St Giles and absolutely loved it and got on board and asked if he could do the audiobook. And he just does it fabulously. I mean, he as an actor, he just plays all the parts and it's like listening to an acting masterclass. It
Mm.
really is just hearing.
Yes, it's
And when I first heard it, I was quite ill just after the launch of the book. I had that dreadful virus that was going around earlier in the year in January, February, and I couldn't move from the bed and I couldn't move my eyes because it hurt so much. So I turned on the audio version of The Blackbirds of St Giles, read by Patterson, and I actually cried because he was so wonderful and I couldn't
oh,
believe I was hearing our words
well, it's
being
very,
brought to
very
life by such a brilliant
yeah,
actor.
I couldn't recommend it more highly.
Thank you.
But one thing, stepping away from your own work, I'm going to like to do with these podcasts is ask my guests at the end of each one if they can suggest a novel or a film or a painting or even a piece of music, just something that they think the listeners might enjoy, something in the Gothic mode. So, what would you
Right.
suggest? Or more than
Um,
one thing if you like, as many as
well,
you like.
Now, funnily enough, I'm going to suggest as a read, it's probably something that everybody knows, but I'm going to suggest Northanger Abbey,
Yes.
Jane Austen's Northanger
Yes,
Abbey,
yes. So
because I love that book. I love Henry Tilney. Of all of Jane Austen's heroes, he'd be the one I'd most like to marry and live the rest of my life with, because he's funny and gentle and he pokes fun at Catherine. But also, what Jane Austen does so brilliantly is she just sort of dismantles the Gothic in
yeah,
that
she
book.
takes all those books
And
that were coming out at the time, doesn't she? And that was like the
she was
monk
right,
and
precisely. So, and,
Otranto, and she destroys them. But
she
her heroine
destroys
is
them
obsessed
basically.
with them, isn't she? She's obsessed with reading them, and it's very
Yeah, she's
funny.
obsessed with Mrs. Radcliffe, and she's obsessed, as you say, with Walpole and Castle of Otranto. And what Jane Austen does so brilliantly is, and delicately, and also I think as a fan, I think she's it's almost like fan fiction,
Mm.
and I just love that book. I really do.
Well, thank you, Kate, for that recommendation of Northanger Abbey, which is such a good one. And again, it's something we could devote a whole episode to. I would like to say goodbye to you now, but I would also like to recommend a piece of music which is very folklory and gothic, and it's by the Unthanks and it's called Magpie, and it reflects the cover of your book, Fine Shade. And I will try to upload it here, but if I can't, I would just say go to YouTube or wherever you get your music and listen to Magpie by the Unthanks. And also, please do read Fine Shade. It is such an entertaining book. It has so many allusions to classic Gothic literature, and I really do think you'll love it. So until the next time when I come back with another episode of Talking the Gothic, thank you, Kate Griffin, and thank you to everyone for listening. Goodbye.